Julia Beck, who's a US lesbian activist, and it will be really fantastic to hear from her. We'll hear from her and then have questions at the end for Julia.
I'm speaking to you from Baltimore City in the state of Maryland in the United States of America. I am a lesbian and I try to promote feminism not just as a theory, but also as a practice. So today I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my story, and then I'll talk about how queer ideology is affecting lesbians in general, as well as in the States specifically. So a little bit about me. Right now I'm working behind the scenes with Women's Liberation Radio News. We are a women-only global news collective, and we broadcast interviews with women from all over the world. I'm also a member of the Women's Liberation Front, known as WOLF, which is based in the United States. WOLF is a women-only organization that advocates for women's sex-based rights at the federal and state levels of government. My first involvement in male politics was 2 years ago in 2018. I joined Baltimore City's LGBTQ Commission to represent lesbians in my local government. In this commission, I was elected to a leadership position. My job was to work with the mayor and other government agencies on policies that would affect the people who I was elected to represent. The first agency I worked with was the police department. I recommended that they use the word sex instead of gender identity in their policies. In committee meetings, I spoke of male rapists who have taken advantage of gender identity policies in order to harm women and girls. A local trans lobbyist heard about this, accused me of transphobia, and led a campaign to get me kicked off of the commission. This lobbyist is a heterosexual man who calls himself a lesbian, and his campaign was successful, unfortunately. My experience is not an isolated incident. I am not the only lesbian or the only woman who has been excluded from so-called inclusive LGBT blah, 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 alphabet soup spaces. In the last few years, there have been very strong and very well-funded efforts to erase women from politics and from social life. For lesbians, this is a double erasure. Not only is our womanhood being redefined to include men, but our sexual boundaries are also challenged for the same purpose: men's entitlement to women's bodies. These recent efforts have been spearheaded by the transgender lobby, which is made up of mostly men who are mostly very rich. If you're curious, please read what Jennifer Bilek has written about the rich white men institutionalizing trans ideology. Her work shows that this is not a grassroots effort to advocate for the underdog. This is a top-down approach that uses the flowery language of queer theory to abolish women's rights. So what does queer mean? Well, Sheila defined it a few moments ago, and I'll say it again. It means strange, deviant, or transgressive. In a world where heterosexuality is considered normal, homosexuality is considered deviant. So the word queer has been used as a slur against lesbians and gay men. Some of us, some lesbians and gay men, mostly gay men, tried to reclaim the slur in order to normalize homosexuality. Gay men wanted to be accepted by their heterosexual brothers, and their efforts to assimilate with and benefit from hetero hegemony somewhat paid off with the recent passage of marriage equality laws in the States. But efforts to reclaim the queer slur have done very little for lesbians. In fact, lesbians are now pressured to call ourselves anything but lesbian. Now, before I go any further, I must give serious thanks to Claire Huchin, a Black lesbian feminist who has written very clearly about this topic. Her writing helped me gain a solid understanding of my own experiences. So I encourage everyone to read her blog. It's called Sister Outrider. And I'm now going to quote some of her work. So queer ideology says that violating boundaries is good, even liberating, and it's even better to have no boundaries at all. Women are expected to be inclusive at all costs. Huchin says that in a queer setting, men are encouraged to prioritize their own pleasure, while women are still expected to accommodate others. Queer politics maintains the patriarchal status quo. The word itself is vague. Queer does not convey any of the sexual boundaries that lesbian does. To be queer is to be sexually fluid, meaning the term is male inclusive. This is incompatible with lesbianism. Huchin says, quote, lesbian sexuality is disputed in queer discourse because it is a direct and positive acknowledgement of biological womanhood. Instead of accepting the female-only sexual boundary of lesbianism, queer ideology positions that boundary as a problem to be overcome. This is why many young lesbians call themselves queer, even though they are same-sex attracted. A lesbian woman who calls herself queer or non-binary obscures the boundaries of her own sexuality in an effort to be recognized as human. Queer ideology objectifies lesbians, making us the subjects of male sexual conquest. This is evident from the research of Angela Wild from Get the L Out. She published a study last year titled Lesbians at Ground Zero, which can be found at getthelout.uk.com. What her research shows is that lesbians face terrible pressure from the alphabet soup community to accept men as sexual partners. Men who claim to be women pressure lesbians to have sex with them in order to validate their own queer gender identities. Lesbians who refuse to consider men as sexual partners are called vagina fetishists, and transphobic. It's so unbelievable, it's hard for me to say. In Angela Wild's study, lesbians reported in-person and online harassment from men and women in LGB, etc. groups, as well as direct sexual harassment, sexual assault, and rape from men who claim to be women. One lesbian said, quote, I was told that homosexuality doesn't exist, and I owed it to my trans sisters to unlearn my genital confusion so I can enjoy letting them penetrate me. Another lesbian reported that the man she went on a date with, who called himself a woman at the time, threatened to get her fired from her job if she refused to sleep with him. It's no surprise that queer politics fails to challenge male sexual entitlement. Men who claim to be women are praised as brave and stunning, while lesbians are demonized by queer activists on the basis that lesbian sexuality is exclusionary and that this exclusion of males equates to bigotry. Lesbianism is exclusive, and that's perfectly fine. But as Claire Huchin says, queer politics has now created a strange, painful context where lesbians are acceptable hate figures for simply maintaining our sexual boundaries. Lesbians are usually left out of the history books, and now we are facing erasure from the very groups that are supposed to represent us. For example, the Stonewall Rebellion is often cited as a turning point in the gay liberation movement here in the States. Stormy de la Ville, a Black lesbian, is credited for instigating the rebellion in 1969. And 1 year later, in 1970, the first Christopher Street Parade was held in New York City. Since then, major cities around the world have Pride parades. Right now in the States, it is Pride Month. I have my lesbian foremothers to thank for their tireless campaigning and advocacy for lesbian visibility. But now in queer circles, men in drag are getting all the credit. In recent years, lesbians in the States protested our erasure at pride parades all over the country. We took to the streets carrying banners, flags, signs, posters. We handed out flyers, we put up stickers, we had catchy slogans. In 2018, women protested in Seattle, Washington, Chicago, Illinois, New York City, and Los Angeles and San Francisco, California, just to name a few places. I marched with 2 lesbians here in Baltimore, and we were met with a variety of responses. Some people cheered for us and told us to raise our signs high. Our signs said things like, "Dykes don't like dick," and "lesbian, not queer." Other people shouted at us, calling us names, telling us to go home. I remember one man jumped into the parade and followed me, asking me to stop holding my "Dykes don't like dick" sign because it made his transgender friend feel uncomfortable. I find this man's request to be quite revealing, because in my mind, the only people who would ever feel discomfort with lesbians defending our sexual boundaries would be rapists. There are a lot of rapists and rape apologists in the general queer community. Many male celebrities who pretend to be something other than men commit heinous crimes against women on camera, but their violence is swept under the rug. Even threats of violence are excused, justified as a defense or protection for any man's tender gender identity. In my city, the Baltimore Transgender Alliance sponsored an event during Pride Week where lesbians would be, quote, hung by their necks. According to the Facebook page, this event was a safe space for everyone in the LGBT blah, blah, blah community, except of course, those of us represented by the first letter of that acronym. The women who marched in San Francisco in 2018 were met with not only threats, but actual violence. And this violence was condoned not only by the organizers of the Pride Parade, but also by the National Center for Lesbian Rights, or the NCLR. Instead of supporting these lesbians, the NCLR condemned them as transphobic. Wolf, the Women's Liberation Front, published an open letter to the NCLR demanding they retract their slanderous statement and remember their purpose to protect and fight for lesbian rights and lesbian liberation. The NCLR is just one of many organizations in the States that claims to support lesbians while promoting the idea that men can be lesbians. The NCLR and groups like it are influencing government officials to accept and promote queer ideology. This is not only affecting community events like Pride, but also the law. Last year, almost every member of the Democratic Party signed 2 different bills that would have obliterated sex-based rights in this country by providing civil rights protections on the basis of gender identity. I testified at hearings for both of those bills, the Violence Against Women Act and the Equality Act. I encouraged my government to support protections on the basis of sexual orientation and to acknowledge biological reality. After all, if the concept of gender identity is federally protected, then distinguishing between the sexes would be punishable by law. Getting feminist testimony on congressional record is a big deal, but doing so was difficult. Those hearings were tense. As one congresswoman was questioning me, a congressman rudely interrupted her to deny women's legitimate concerns of male violence. Also, instead of sharing rational arguments, other witnesses who represented powerful lobby groups repeated brain-dead slogans and bad statistics. My testimony, my witness testimony, was framed by leftist media outlets like LGBTQ Nation as hateful and transphobic. Even members of my own community, lesbians who I used to dance with, sent me pictures of my face photoshopped on the body of Adolf Hitler. I was kicked out of a local bar because my presence there made men who claim to be lesbians feel unsafe. And one of the bouncers compared me to the leader of the KKK. I marvel at the cowardice of these men. They say they feel unsafe when they see lesbians having a good time on the dance floor. But when women confront them about their misogyny, as Julia Long and Posey Parker did last year, these men have nothing substantial to say. Julia and Posey confronted a male trans lobbyist who supports the sterilization of prepubescent teenagers. But this man, this coward, pretended like Julia and Posey weren't even there. There are so many men like him who work directly with government agencies, who hate women and fetishize lesbians so deeply that they pretend to be us. But the only thing these men have on their side is fear, not logic or reason. They use the threat of being excluded or the threat of suicide to influence powerful groups as well as common people to support a movement that is misogynistic to the core. They push policies and legislation that are written in the backwards language of postmodern queer theory without welcoming any public input. Right now, in 48 of the 50 United States, as well as in 2 US territories, citizens can change their vital records, like birth certificates and driver's licenses, to show that they are a member of the opposite sex, or that they have no sex at all. According to the National Center for Transgender Equality, Tennessee and Ohio are the only 2 states that do not allow people to falsify their records in this way. Some states have tried to set boundaries that would maintain female-only spaces. According to the National Center of State Legislatures, at least 24 states considered bills that would protect women and girls from male predators in public toilets and locker rooms, but only 1 state, North Carolina, passed one of these bills into law. After months of pressure from alphabet soup groups like the Human Rights Campaign and the American Civil Liberties Union, that law was repealed. The Human Rights Campaign, or the HRC, is the largest lobbying group in the United States, and it provides funding to political candidates who promote queer ideology. The HRC also spends money on political opposition against anyone or any group who dares to defend the sex-based rights of women. The American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU, is similar in its use of money for political and ideological means. Women usually don't have a lot of money, especially if we are lesbians. So if we want to do something big, we have to fundraise, take out loans, apply for grants or scholarships. Women of the second wave found a way to make things happen with or without money. But I will say money definitely makes things easier. These women built a movement together, brick by brick. But now, the female-only spaces that women in the States once enjoyed are not so available. Women's bookstores and bars across the country have either become inclusive, according to the demands of queer activists, or else they've closed for good. Julia Penelope, in her piece titled "The Mystery of Lesbians," named over 25 cities across the US and Mexico where she could go to lesbian or gay bars and have a good time. Things are different now, but our need for community hasn't changed. Today, we have a powerful tool that our foremothers didn't, the World Wide Web. We have the power to create and record like never before. So if the media doesn't represent us, we need to become the media. We can amplify each other's voices, support women writers and artists, and create a new wave of lesbian and feminist culture. We don't have to get involved in male politics in order for our voices to be heard, although political advocacy can be effective. You don't need to cause a big splash in order to make a great wave. Waves are created one ripple at a time. So stand up, speak out, connect with one another, start sharing your stories, and encourage each other to say no more often. Women have the right to organize as women only. Lesbians have the right to organize as lesbians only. We all have the right to set our own boundaries, politically, socially, and sexually. So let's get to it. And thanks for listening.
Do we need the label homosexual to defend our lesbian existence and our decision to have boundaries that men cannot cross? As a lesbian feminist, I have a conflict using the sexual orientations rhetoric, and I'm hoping we can defend our rights from queer politics without using LGTB politics, i.e. born this way or sexual orientations rhetoric.
So I am a big proponent of diverse tactics. I think that there is not just one way to go about things. I do think that we need to hold on to the term lesbian, because homosexual refers to men too. And for the longest time, it referred socially, culturally, only to men, just like the word gay. So, and then that's my understanding of the development of this language that refers to gay people or homosexual people. Women use the word lesbian to describe our specific experience of being female people attracted to other female people. So I know that different jurisdictions, different places with different governments, they have different language in their laws, which are all different, as is the case in the 50 United States. I do think that we need to make a choice about what serves our purposes best. We can be, I think it really does depend on the context, but I'll just say we need to maintain the fact that we are lesbians. If we are lesbians, we are lesbians. And I think the word homosexual does erase our female reality. Not completely, but it doesn't name our female reality in the way that lesbian does.
Julia, I was sexually assaulted by a trans woman, in other words, a man. I felt such intense misogyny when this happened and began to see the reality of the medical, social control and oppression of women by the trans agenda. I'm in a women's studies class that preaches the queer agenda. However, I'm afraid to publicly speak out and have my grades marked down or lose my job. I want to get past this fear and slowly start to assert my position. What do you recommend for initial activism efforts? How do you recommend bringing this topic up to trans people?
I have battled with myself, or battled with this question about what is the best method of action here. The person asking this question, I'm very sorry. My heart goes out to you for what you've experienced. No woman should ever have to experience that, or man. I mean, but I'm not really thinking about them today. So I'm very sorry to hear that this happened to you, that a man hurt you this way. I think that it is important for us to speak out. It is important for us to use our real names and to use our real voices and to share our real faces. But I also recognize that not every woman can do this. Not every woman is insulated in a way that her economic survival, or in this case, your academic survival, can be maintained. There is a serious risk to speaking out. I know how frustrating it is to be in a space that promotes queer ideology. I hate it, and I can assume that you are also very frustrated as well. You can work with other women outside of this space. You can work within this space like incognito, as like a spy, you know, gathering information and seeing what the arguments are being used in current times. I know that the language is always changing, and this is one of the most difficult parts about confronting this political ideology, is that the language is always changing. So what you can do without putting yourself yourself or your safety at risk, is just go along in that space. Don't really, because I know it can be very risky, and you've already experienced violence. So what you can do is still exist in that space, gather information, and share it with other women around you, or other women you meet online, and organize with women. I know how draining it is to be in those spaces, but if you have no other option, if you can't get out of that space, if you need to be in that space to get your degree or get services or supplies in your community, I know it sucks. You're going to have to tough it out if you don't feel comfortable being public, which I understand it's not easy to do.
Thanks very much, Julia. So there's another question from Florence Felsham. Hi, Julia. You're so inspirational. I was wondering how you would advise young rad femmes to deal with social and/or academic retaliation.
Another really great question. And thanks for asking. Hi, Florence. Young women who are speaking out about this and are getting shut down or kicked out of social groups or barred from academic groups or things like this. Yeah, it's a serious problem. The more we speak out about this stuff, the easier it becomes for everyone else to speak out about it. I want to share a science animal story that one of the women who I have communed with has shared with me. It's about frogs. When there are a bunch of frogs in the swamp, they're all singing, they're happy, ribbiting very loudly. When a predator comes by, they all go silent because they want to stay safe. Once the predator leaves, all it takes is one frog to start ribbiting again, to start a little bit testing the water, you know? Maybe that frog will get eaten, maybe not, but all it takes is one, and the rest of them start up again. So I know that it's very difficult and very scary sometimes to have your safety threatened, or to be kicked out of your friend group, or to be barred from school. This is a very serious form of exclusion and punishment and ostracized. It's when you are ostracized. We are social creatures and we need to have social support. So I understand the threat of it. It's very real. But all it takes is one. So if you can, find other women around you or connect with them online, or even open up a book written by a woman and create that dialogue or create that space with her or with those other women. As soon as you make those connections, you're going to feel so much better because you won't be alone.